Good evening, everyone. My name is Jennifer Fox, and I am a volunteer with Results Austin and one of the organizers of this event this evening. And on behalf of Results, CARE, and the Strauss Center, I just wanted to welcome everyone to this public forum on foreign aid reform. Really, first, I just wanted to thank all of you for coming here tonight. I mean, I know there's a lot of other ways you could be spending your evening, and we really appreciate it that you've taken some time to be with us and learn a little bit more about this really important topic and issue. The purpose of this evening's event is really to bring together both policy area experts as well as members of the community and LBJ students, et cetera, who have some kind of interest in foreign aid and in international development, and to discuss the current state of foreign affairs, but more importantly, really to discuss and develop some recommendations in terms of how we're able to fundamentally improve our foreign aid system. I think many people have probably heard that there's been issues, and so the idea here tonight is really to think about what are some of those issues and what practical solutions can we come up with as subject experts and members of the Austin community in terms of improving our foreign aid system. Now, tonight's program will begin with some brief background on foreign aid and on the reform and some of the legislation, and it's going to be followed by reading of several statements now. We originally thought we were going to have Congressman McCall here to do opening remarks, and earlier we thought we might even have Congressman Doggett, and disappointingly, I guess, and unfortunately, none of them are able to attend this evening. However, we've gotten statements from both Congressman Doggett's office, and now we actually have another one from Senator Cornyn. So we're going to be reading those just to give you a sense of sort of the position that our elected officials have when it comes to foreign aid reform. After that, we will begin the panel discussion, and I just wanted to let you know that we will have opportunity for audience Q&A. We really, really want your feedback, and one of the reasons for that is that we are actually recording all of the information that's being presented and shared tonight, and particularly focusing on, like I say, some of these recommendations, and not just the recommendations and information coming from the panelists, but also from the audience members. And our plan is to actually prepare a repertoires report that we intend to share with members of Congress and with different international NGOs and different groups. So again, we really want your feedback. I also wanted to point out, and I think everybody's already seen it, but right by the elevator we have a table of information that has more information on results and on CARE. And if anybody's interested, we also have a sign-in sheet if you want to learn more about those two organizations, or even learn a little bit more about Strauss Center and some of the programs and work that they do. I think now it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this evening's event, and that's Dr. Catherine Kate Weaver. And Dr. Weaver is the Distinguished Scholar Research Coordinator at the Strauss Center for International Security and Law and an assistant professor at the LBJ School. Dr. Weaver's research and teaching has focused primarily on international organizations and development, with a particular focus on politics and reform of the World Bank and IMF. Her book, Hypocrisy Trap, The World Bank and the Poverty of Reform, received both the Chadwick Alger Prize for Best Book on International Organizations and Multilateralism from the International Studies Association and the Harold D. Laswell Prize from the Society of Policy Scientists. Before coming to UT, Dr. Weaver served as an assistant professor of political science at the University of Kansas, and prior to that, she was a Brookings Research Fellow in Foreign Policy Studies at the Brookings Institute in Washington, D.C. And without further ado, Dr. Catherine Weaver.
Okay. Thank you, Jennifer. First of all, I want to thank Jennifer for doing an amazing job organizing this event. Really, she did all the legwork on this. I'm going to try to keep this very brief, but I've been given sort of an impossible task. I'm supposed to provide sort of a definition of the problem that we're facing today and a background on U.S. foreign aid. I can't do this justice without at least, 2 or 3 years of talking time. But I'm probably going to try to describe this essentially an existential crisis for U.S. foreign aid, essentially in 4 parts. And recently there's been several legislative proposals regarding how we might think about the problem of foreign aid and how we might reform U.S. foreign assistance. In particular, Senators John Kerry and Dick Lugar introduced, I think in June of this year, the Foreign Assistance Revitalization Accountability Act, which focuses on enhancing the role of USAID and increasing transparency policies. We also have out of the House, we have a call for a national strategy for global development from Howard Berman and his colleagues that serves to call on the Obama administration to come up with a grand view for reform of U.S. foreign assistance. And there are 4 issues at stake here that really, I think, speak to a primordial issues in foreign aid. Number 1 has to do with essential questions about to whom we give aid, for what, and under what conditions. We have over 60 years of experience now and real no good conclusive evidence about what works, when aid is actually effective, and under what sets of conditions we can actually make our taxpayer dollars work to their best benefit. There are also key questions regarding the architecture of U.S. foreign aid. To date, we have about 12 departments, 25 agencies, and over 60 government units that are tasked with delegating U.S. foreign aid. There's an immense need to streamline all of this aid and to increase interagency coordination, which is not an easy task. Also, there's been a huge effort to increase accountability, both on the donor side of foreign aid as well as the recipient side. And then finally, there's an effort to increase monitoring and evaluation to make sure that aid actually works and that we know that it works and under what conditions. So with these existential questions in mind, we're going to hear about the initiatives that our representatives have for U.S. foreign assistance. So I'm going to keep my comments brief here. And Jennifer, you have the more impossible task of actually reading all 3 statements into record. We have statements from Senator Cornyn, Representative Doggett, and a jointly authored statement from Representatives McCall, Smith, and Carter.
Thank you very much, Dr. Weaver. Okay, I'm going to first read the statement from Senator John Cornyn. Dear friends, I commend you on your dedication to open the dialogue on meaningful reform of U.S. foreign assistance. This gathering is timely, as the Senate may consider amending the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961 in the near future. Foreign aid can directly serve our national interests by promoting stability, fostering democracy, and encouraging economic liberalization. Moreover, foreign aid has become an important tool with which to combat terrorism. In 2006, then President George W. Bush outlined the United States National Security Strategy, stating that global development, together with defense and diplomacy, is the 3rd pillar of our national security. To this end, the United States provides foreign assistance to approximately 150 countries and is the world's largest donor of foreign aid, providing over $20 billion in fiscal year 2008. In January 2004, Congress authorized the Millennium Challenge Corporation, a government entity that provides financial assistance to developing nations. In contrast to earlier foreign aid programs, the MCC requires that countries make political and economic reforms in order to receive aid. The MCC ensures that U.S. foreign aid is directed to countries where it will have the greatest impact and provides countries a powerful incentive to embrace and sustain democratic and economic reforms. Due in large part to the establishment of the MCC and other presidential aid priority, the HIV/AIDS Initiative development assistance now represents over half of U.S. foreign aid. Foreign aid represents less than 1% of the federal budget, yet it plays a key role in furthering our national interests abroad. At the same time, it is equally important that Congress act as a reasonable steward of taxpayer dollars, ensuring that funds are administered transparently and efficiently, and that all foreign aid goes toward promoting the interests of the United States. I'm hopeful that these priorities will remain intact as Congress considers reforming U.S. foreign assistance. I appreciate having the opportunity to represent the interest of Texans in the United States Senate, and you may be certain that I welcome continued input from my constituents as the Senate considers this issue in coming months. Sincerely, Senator John Cornyn. This next statement is a joint statement, and again, this is from Congressman Michael McCall, Lamar Smith, and John Carter. Distinguished panelists, we would like to thank you for inviting us to be part of the discussions on foreign aid reform with these distinguished panel members. Okay. U.S. foreign aid programs lack effective oversight. We believe that Congress needs to do a better job in promoting concrete reform, transparency, and accountability throughout our assistance programs to prevent extremist organizations from profiting off our taxpayer dollars. Congress and the administration have a responsibility to make the policy changes necessary to ensure that hard-earned tax dollars are spent in a transparent and accountable manner that advances U.S. interests and are not used for malignant purposes. Foreign assistance needs to be context-specific, not a one-size-fits-all model. In general, assistance should be driven by host country needs. There must be good governance and accountability for this model to function as intended. Reform should not only be a debate about increasing aid funding, it should be comprehensive, involving programs and personnel, and a review of underlying concepts and of the experience of the past few decades. We must build effectiveness into our programs by helping the most impoverished play a role in assessing what works for them. Reform should recognize the preeminent role of economic growth in the elimination of poverty and the related importance of moving from aid programs to trade and investment. Aid cannot purchase growth, and ultimately economic growth is only means by which those in poverty can move forward. The dominant approach to foreign aid today allows governments of aid recipient countries to evade their proper responsibilities to their own citizens, become ever more dependent on outside sources of aid, and permit governmental corruption to flourish, diminishing rather than encouraging economic growth. Reform should ensure efficiency and accountability in compensation levels of top staff at NGOs engaged in foreign aid implementation. The continuing reports of excessive pay and benefits for chief executive officers and other top staff at some NGOs that implement much of our foreign aid programs overseas is disturbing. Reform should include the development of objective means by which to assess the appropriate time for graduation of aid recipient countries from U.S. assistance programs for poverty elimination. Some observers of foreign aid for poverty reduction appear to believe that success can only be achieved if we provide enough funding to implement everything that everyone expects our programs to do. There is a need to develop metrics by which we can ascertain when we can graduate countries from such assistance, leaving behind the means of self-reliance that our aid programs are intended to produce. Thank you for your time, and if you have additional questions, please do not hesitate to contact our offices. Sincerely, Congressman Michael McCaul, Congressman John Carter, and Congressman Lamar Smith. One more. Okay. And this one, again, is from Congressman Lloyd Doggett. First, let me offer to the organizers of this forum, the Strauss Center Care and Results, my thanks. As Congress undertakes a much-needed overhaul of the U.S. Foreign Assistance Program, this event could not be timelier. I am a strong supporter of foreign aid and believe that our government's mission abroad, as it is at home, is to build societies in which all individuals can achieve their full potential. I look forward to furthering this vision in the months ahead and appreciate the invitation to share some of my own thinking on foreign assistance. Several key principles have and will continue to guide my efforts in Washington. First, Congress has an important role to play in demanding strong leadership and transparency from the U.S. foreign aid bureaucracy. I share the disappointment of many of my congressional colleagues, for example, at the continued absence of a USAID administrator, and have joined them in calling on President Obama to redouble his search for a nominee. I also believe Congress must be vigilant in its efforts to ensure accountability from the agencies responsible for foreign assistance. In 1997, for instance, I passed legislation prohibiting USAID from promoting tobacco in any of its overseas operations, and over a decade later, I continue to monitor compliance with this provision. Second, foreign assistance must be considered within a larger framework of human rights promotion. As just one example, I have called for a reconfiguration of our assistance package to Colombia, the largest recipient of U.S. aid outside of the Middle East. Over the past 10 years, the U.S. has provided more than $6 billion to Colombia. While security has improved in some areas, serious rights violations continue. Accordingly, I have urged the administration to prioritize funding for Colombia's judicial system, programs to further the rights of its indigenous communities, and assistance to refugees and internally displaced. Third, foreign assistance policy reform should be driven by past successes and lessons learned. We know that channeling aid to women and girls is one of the most effective ways of assisting societies out of poverty and conflict, which is why I'm a sponsor of legislation such as the Afghan Women Empowerment Act. We know that economic growth depends upon the emergence of safe, well-regulated financial systems, which is why for the past 2 years I've requested appropriations to help transition countries develop their capital markets. We know that simple health interventions can save millions of lives each year, which is why I have called for the robust funding for mechanisms like the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. These are just a few examples of smart approaches that I believe should take priority in our foreign assistance program. I applaud this forum for giving our community the opportunity to discuss and debate key strategies and for reinforcing a view of foreign assistance not as charity to strangers, not as charity to strangers we will never meet, but as an investment in an increasingly interconnected world. I look forward to being your partner in Washington as we work toward comprehensive reform. And I've been told specifically that Congressman Doggett would like any comments or feedback that you have at all to actually be directed to him, and that can go to lloyd.doggett@mail.house.gov if anyone's interested. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's now my pleasure to introduce 4 very distinguished speakers for this evening. And collectively, they bring to the conversation a wealth of first-hand experience in international development aid. Immediately to my left is Ambassador Louis Luck, who is currently president of Luck & Associates. Ambassador Luck also formerly served as ambassador to the Kingdom of Swaziland and served for over 20 years at USAID. He worked at several overseas locations all over the world, and he received the highest service award given by USAID, the Administrator's Distinguished Career Award in 2001. Dara Francis is one of our own here at the Strauss Center. Dara has worked as an independent consultant specializing in the role of civil society and democracy promotion. She has amazing war stories from all over Africa, where she was a program officer at the International Republican Institute and designed and managed programs on governance reform, election preparations, civic participation, and conflict mitigation. She even has a couple stories about dodging bullets that you should pick her brain about. Immediately to her left is John Fawcett, who is a Results Global Legislative Director. And John manages the legislative strategy for issues on global health, basic education, and microcredit, as well as the big issue of foreign aid reform. He has formerly held positions with Save the Children and Health Research Group at Public Citizen. Finally, we have also Kate Phillips-Barrasso, who is a senior policy advocate for CARE in Washington, D.C. Kate also works on analyzing aid policies and advancing legislation on issues related to foreign aid reform, girls' education, and gender-based violence. She's also worked for the United Nations Development Program Millennium Campaign. So as sort of an opening question for you all, I'm hoping that you could give us a bit of background from your experience in international development aid, but I have one very big question for you. And that is based upon your extensive experience at really the front lines of international development aid. What would be the one big issue you would tackle in U.S. foreign assistance reform, and how might we effectively tackle this? So, Ambassador, would you like to go first?
Thank you. Is this microphone okay? Can you hear? I had the great honor of serving as an American ambassador not too long ago, and one of the great attributes that you think about when you become an American ambassador is you can get up and give a speech about absolutely any subject, any time, and sometimes people actually know what you're talking about, or they think that they understand what you're talking about. The subject of foreign assistance is really one, though, that if I don't know something about it, I should probably be run out of here. Because I spent 27 years working for USAID in the field. So I will leave it to my colleagues here to speak a little bit more about the Washington side of things, because I have, I guess perhaps in my mature years here, There comes a time when you think you've heard it all before, but in terms of reform, accountability, transparency, and so forth. And believe me, I've been hearing this, and I guess the rest of this is there comes a time in your career when you've heard it 3 or 4 times, not just once. So I assure you that transparency and accountability have always been very high priorities for economic assistance overseas, because if it was not, we wouldn't get any. Because until 9/11, really there was no constituency, or very little constituency for economic development, except for the organizations that really carried it out and implemented it with and for USAID, which is now, as you have heard already, there has been a proliferation of not only mandates, but also agencies scattered around the government and the private sector and the public and the NGO sector that are involved in all of this, in carrying out so many of the various mandates here. I'll answer the question in just a second. But I told you I was an ambassador, and
you have 5 minutes.
Oh, I have 5 minutes. Oh, good. Okay. So only owe you 3 back. Right. Okay. I would say really, and there's many things that I could really say and spend a lot of time talking about, but I believe that one of the greatest improvements or the greatest needs that I would mention, at least first here, and I say this is from the point of view of a practitioner in aid. It wasn't said in the introduction, but I've been a USAID mission director in 5 different countries. I was mission director in Bolivia, in Haiti, in Brazil, Jordan, and when Jordan went from $7 million to about $250 million a year, and I was the first USAID mission director in Iraq. Okay, you may not have known that. We had the largest program, $4 billion, of any American reconstruction and economic development program since the Marshall Plan. And I've spent a lot of time reading and writing and giving speeches about that particular thing. But to go back where I started to make my conclusion about what the biggest thing that I would do is, with all this proliferation of agencies involved in the implementation of these programs, with all of the different mandates, one of the things that has been lost, I think, is the ability to effectively implement these programs based on the fact that there are too many mandates. It's too scattered all over the environment. USAID, which used to be the preeminent development agency in the world, has been essentially marginalized, and it goes back to the politics of the fights between the Republicans and the Democrats, particularly in the 90s, when the Republican-led Congress basically cut off much of the funding for USAID in a very inappropriate lead-up, I would say, to 9/11, when we needed this kind of investment, these kinds of skills, these abilities on the part of our government to respond to things that would otherwise be the root of 9/11 and future 9/11s. We were not able to do it. The exodus has continued. I keep saying USAID and we because I spent 27 lovely years there, and I'm very much a believer in effective economic assistance programs. But we simply have to do a better job of reestablishing USAID as the preeminent development agency in the world by providing resources, by providing well-trained new staff. We lost a whole generation of staff members. We need to do more of an implementation ourselves, which is something that we can do with more staff, because right now we basically contract everything out to contractors or grantees called in Washington Beltway bandits, and we should be doing a lot of this ourselves. There's more I will say, but more I can say, but I think I'll cease because of the time.
Thank you. Okay. Dara.
Okay. Wow. Well, I'd like to thank Jennifer Fox and the folks at Results for inviting me here. When she called me to ask me to give sort of my perceptions of reforming foreign assistance, I remember I was at lunch on my cell phone, and I sort of rolled my eyes Reforming foreign assistance. Yeah, okay. And so I'm sort of going to give you the grumpy field practitioner perspective, and Eugene Goltz has deputized me as the official grumpy person of the night, because you're going to fight me for that. But you know, when we sat up here, when we sat down, I looked at Laura Jones, who has organized all this for us this evening, and I said, who put me in the middle? Why am I between the ambassador and, you know, the legislative folks? You know, I'm just the, again, grumpy field person. But in a way, it's sort of appropriate because it's really, you know, being in the field is like being between a rock and a hard place, because you're constrained by, you know, whatever legislation is decided in Washington. And ultimately, with respect to the U.S. government, your boss in the field is the highest ranking U.S. person, which is usually the ambassador. And sometimes you're getting conflicting information from, you know, the Hill or from USAID or from the State Department or from other organizations working on the ground. And while, you know, by no means am I a, you know, expert on foreign assistance and reforming it, I have some really strong opinions about the topic. But the first thing I had to do this evening was sort of orient myself, because, again, when we talk about foreign aid, we mentioned the Foreign Assistance Aid Act of 1961, and some of you in the audience might be familiar with attempts to reform that. You know, in the 1970s during the Vietnam War, there was a lot of opposition to the war. And the thought was, well, maybe by reforming the Assistance Bill of 1961, we can get at, you know, some of the issues and make U.S. foreign assistance stronger. And again, attempts were made in the 1980s, and there were creation of organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy, or the organization I worked for, the International Republican Institute, which looked at helping developing countries become stronger in the area of governance. And then on to the Clinton administration in the 90s, they tried to reform the Foreign Assistance Act, and nothing really has happened. Which leads us, I think, to the Bush administration, who, although they were never able to actually change legislation, a lot of things were done. We have this, well, I guess the position doesn't exist anymore, but there was a director of foreign assistance that was created, who was both the USAID administrator as well as a deputy secretary of state in the State Department, which was supposed to help come up with a grand strategy for how foreign assistance should be implemented. And where we find ourselves now is, I think, with the Obama administration, which isn't really new anymore, we're sort of looking around at each other to say, you know, what do we do now? Where do we go? And again, when this was mentioned to sort of flesh out some of the changes that could be made, I was sort of hesitant, because I feel like every attempt to change legislation sort of calls on the same things, right? Transparency, accountability, you know, all the little terms that we know and we hear all the time, but what does it really all mean? So the first thing I did, you know, what we do is go to Google. And I was just curious about what the recent attempts have been made, and looking at the legislation that Congressman Berman put forward, one thing that really struck me was the inclusion of language about monitoring and evaluation. And that was something that made me, again, grumpy field person, it made me really excited, because it's the one area of foreign assistance that I think would make a huge difference. And I'm glad that it's finally being included in discussions around Washington. So why is monitoring and evaluation so important? Well, let me back up for a minute. The legislation basically lays out three things as being important for reform. The first being an overall strategy for global government or global development in the world. That's a big order. I'm going to leave that one alone. Secondly, there's a mention of coming up with better methods of being accountable and transparent in foreign aid. That's understandable. But finally, there's this question of monitoring and evaluation practices. And so I've been told I'm running out of time, but I think I'll just lay out sort of the 3 issues I have with current monitoring and evaluation practices in U.S. government funded programming, foreign assistance programs. The first is USAID, which is where I have most of my experience working as a USAID implementing partner, as we're called. I think the number one problem is that most of these programs are tracked by outputs and not by outcomes. So when a program is developed, aid comes to you and says, when you conduct these programs, the most important thing is I want to know how many people you trained, how many bags of rice delivered, and it's all driven by counting heads. And there are all kinds of problems. I don't need to explain to you LBJ students that are taking all these statistical analyses courses what the problem is in just counting heads. It doesn't really tell you what you're getting for counting these heads. I don't have a solution for all of that, but it's a huge problem for implementing organizations that are working with aid. The second problem, which is related to the first, is there's a lot of self-editing and self-correcting going on with respect to the organizations that are implementing programs for aid. So aid says, here's the money, go count heads. If there are any problems, it's up to you to correct yourself, as well as report on yourself, as well as monitor yourself, and then evaluate yourself. And as we know with anything in life, if you're telling someone to provide a service, and then you're telling them to pat themselves on the back or not pat themselves on the back if they're not doing a job, that's sort of a ridiculous way to track projects that you're investing in. And finally, this is sort of a personal pet peeve of mine. I would say the final issue with monitoring and evaluation, a lot of aid programs, is human resources. Unfortunately, we have a lot of very well-intentioned people going out to the field to do all kinds of programs. Unfortunately, the folks that are out making a lot of the important decisions aren't like Ambassador Luck. They're more like me, who are a lot younger, a lot earlier in their career or mid-career, who don't have as much experience, or there are people who are development experts who may have been in democracy and governance like myself, monitoring and evaluating programs, and then switch over to monitoring and evaluation in HIV programs. So there's a lot of issues with human resources. I have no more time. I'm happy to answer any more questions and go more in depth about this, but just sort of wanted to lay out some of the issues related to monitoring and evaluation in foreign assistance. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. And since we're going from Iraq to a hard place, we then shift to the legislative forum. So, John, you want to talk about what it's like in D.C. right now?
It's colder than it is here. I had the pleasure of spending the weekend here. I could get used to it. So I think we just had some really important comments, I think, about monitoring and evaluation, which I want to pick up on a little bit. Just to give you a sense of what my perspective is, I mean, Results is an advocacy organization. We're not an implementing organization. We don't have programs overseas. We are a collection of grassroots advocates, people in over 100 communities across the country that have something to say about what the role of the U.S. should be in the world, and specifically the U.S. role in eliminating extreme poverty. And we find that a lot of people sort of have opinions about that, but don't necessarily have the skill set that they need to talk to other members of their community, to talk to their elected officials, to talk to members of the media, to try to drive that agenda forward. So that's really what Results is all about. So I come at this really from the position of an advocate, and one who has worked on legislative language around different kinds of foreign assistance programs. And I think what's interesting is that it's one of the things that I think that we're finding with some of the legislation that's been discussed is that there are frankly limits to what legislative language can do. It's only one of the policy tools that we have, and if two agencies don't want to coordinate or two people don't want to coordinate, it's exceptionally difficult to mandate that in law that they sort of people get along. So I think the sort of lesson there is I think there needs to be a legislative framework that is useful and constructive and enables people to do their jobs. There also, it just also comes down to leadership and people being in key positions that are capable and driven and committed to getting the job done. So with that sort of, I guess, overview of my perspective on kind of legislation in particular, there are a number of things I would like to see that results would like to see reflected in a new Foreign Assistance Act and in our foreign assistance programs generally. And they're all going to sound incredibly simple and straightforward and maybe obvious, but I don't think that they are once you dig into them a little bit. One is that we think that foreign assistance should really be for the primary purpose of alleviating poverty. And by that I don't just mean income poverty, sort of how much money is the household making, but kind of a broader definition of poverty that would include, deprivation to sort of basic human needs like health, education, as well as a human rights perspective. So that should be the primary purpose. And I think when a lot of Americans sort of express their support for or skepticism of foreign aid, it's sort of related to that question. Is that what it's really being used for? People tend to be supportive of programs to make sure that families have access to clean water, that kids have a decent education. But there's a lot of skepticism about how foreign aid is actually being used, and some of it is frankly warranted. And so by when I say focus on poverty, I mean a couple of things. I mean, one, that the money should in fact go to the poorest countries. Right now, only about 25% of our foreign assistance goes to the least developed countries, the very poorest classification of countries. So that right there is an indicator that maybe that things are skewed a little bit. And that also within those countries that it goes to the poorest people. There is great inequality in many of the countries where we deliver foreign assistance. And if you are building a hospital in a capital, for example, you may not be reaching the people that actually most need the health services, who are the people not just at the end of the road, but beyond the road. So money to the poorest people, and money to the poorest countries, I think, are sort of important principles that we would want to see in our foreign assistance. I mean, one example actually I think is a country like Jordan, where Ambassador Luck has some experience, where we give a lot of money to Jordan for I think viable national security reasons. I mean, there's a logic to why we give money to Jordan that has to do with U.S. interests and security in the Middle East. But a lot of that money is programmed through ways like one example would be, maternal and child health money. And this is the kind of bread and butter foreign assistance stuff, the stuff that we're actually really good at, giving vaccinations and making sure kids are healthy, making sure women are able to deliver their children in a safe environment. So we give actually a fair amount of money to Jordan to do maternal and child health programs. We give less money to Ethiopia, which is a country that is many, many times the size of Jordan and has much, much worse outcomes in terms of maternal and child health. Now, you don't have to be a political scientist to figure out why we give a lot more money to Jordan than we do to Ethiopia on maternal and child health. But if you approach that with a public health or a poverty lens, you would come up with an allocation that would be different. So if we're saying that we're giving money for reasons like saving kids' lives, then the allocation and the programming should probably reflect that. A couple of other quick points about how I think foreign assistance could and should be improved. Second would be what we tend to call country ownership, which is basically just means that the money that we give reflects the priorities of the communities that are meant to receive it. And it's a very tricky thing to do, but it's important if you want to be effective in actually meeting the needs of the people that you're trying to help in some way. I think one of the trickiest things is what's the model for doing that? It's very hard to actually receive input from communities, particularly poor and marginalized communities, and then design your programs in a way that actually reach them. There are a couple of models out there. The Millennium Challenge Corporation, which has been mentioned, which is a U.S. assistance program, I think has probably done more thinking about this than any other U.S. agency in terms of letting a country define its own priorities. There are other models as well. The Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, Malaria, which Representative Doggett mentioned in his results. It's got something called the Country Coordinating Mechanism, which means that everyone in the country or different constituencies in the country are required to actually come up with a plan to address AIDS, TB, malaria. And that means the private sector, it means faith-based organizations, doctors, nurses, labor unions who have members who are doctors and nurses, as well as like patient groups. All those people have to actually come up and sit around the same table and come up with a plan. And we think that that's, certainly a better model than the way a lot of U.S. assistance is currently directed. So focus on poverty, focus on country ownership, and then thirdly, I would just, really strongly endorse what Dara said about results and accountability. And I think that we need to really set clear objectives and then measure against those objectives. Otherwise, it's incredibly difficult to know whether or not aid has in fact been reformed when you have not really defined success from the output, and then you're not measuring appropriately, right, against that progress. And one specific example of what she talked about in terms of inputs or outputs rather versus outcomes is there have been there's sort of any number of examples to cite. Unfortunately, I'll cite one from basic education. The U.S. gives last fiscal year about $700 million to make sure kids get in school and get an education. The next fiscal year, it figures to be closer to $1 billion. Those dollars are really important. They're doing some really important work, but we're not doing a very good job of tracking how that money is actually making sure that kids are better educated. So a real specific example would be we're measuring things like enrollment rates, right? How many kids are actually in school, but not necessarily measuring learning outcomes like we do in this country. Are kids actually, are they educated when they come out the other side of the school system? That's an example of like an outcome measure that would give us a much better sense of whether or not we're being effective. And that's it's important for accountability. It's also important for these kinds of course corrections to make sure that in the midst of a program we can figure out if there are problems and then correct them along the way. So I would say focus on poverty, focus on the poorest countries, focus on the poorest people. Design your assistance in a way where you're actually able to receive the input of the communities that are being benefited, hopefully. And finally, you've got to sort of set bold targets, measure against them. And these are some of the ingredients that we would like to see in a new Foreign Assistance Act, as well as some other sort of aid reform initiatives.
Great. Thank you, John. Kate?
Okay. So I guess the advantage of being the last person to speak is that you get more time to plan what you're saying. But then when other people say what you wanted to say, it's a little bit of a problem. And I agree with everything that the other panelists have noted. They're all really important considerations and definitely issues CARE would support. And I guess I have to give a little introduction to CARE. Not just for your benefit, but also so you understand where we're coming to in foreign aid reform discussions. CARE is an operational aid organization, both humanitarian assistance and development assistance. And it's interesting when you look back at the sort of arc of CARE's history, because a lot of CARE started in the aftermath of World War II, actually delivering CARE packages, which were U.S. Army rations that were left over from World War II to people in, countries that had been devastated by the conflict, which is right around the same time that the U.S. began our modern, foreign assistance program through the Marshall Plan. And it's interesting to see what we've learned over the course of 60 years as an aid implementer and sort of line it up to the arc of the U.S. government's history as a donor and see sort of where the lessons learned are playing out in the way that we implement programs. I would note, though, that while CARE it does implement U.S. government assistance, we have moved further and further away from relying on the U.S. government as a donor. I think that we've gone down to somewhere near 30 to 40% of our funding comes from the U.S. government, but increasingly we're seeing private donations and foundations that really making up a lot of the funding that we use to implement in the field. So CARE over time, has moved away from delivering packages to people in Europe and Asia to really understanding development is a process and that you need to empower people and moving away from a basic service delivery model, which is something that we engaged in for quite some time, where we delivered assistance, whether it's food assistance or immunizing children, et cetera, to really starting to focus on what some of what we call the underlying causes of poverty are. People are poor for a reason, because they exist in landscapes that permit poverty, or because of discrimination and consistent marginalization of certain groups. So CARE is focused a lot more on capacity building, addressing some of the inequities in different countries. And we do this work in 66 countries around the world. I think we have roughly 1,000 programs that touch the lives in some way, shape, or form of 55 million people around the world. So having our fingers in lots of pots around the year sort of gives us a unique vantage point, whether it's because we're implementing U.S. government assistance or the assistance of other donor countries like the UK or the European Commission, to really understand how donor behavior can affect can determine the effectiveness of development interventions. And that could be what you're prioritizing or how planning occurs, and also the disbursement of aid and how it's implemented. So, while we think that it's fantastic and do agree that the numbers are going up in terms of how much a country like the U.S. government is providing in assistance, we think the how they provide that assistance is just as important as the how much. So, I think that the one area, it's really hard to narrow down to one area that you would choose to fix, but the one area that I would choose to fix, or informed by the organization's vast experience, is that the decision-making around U.S. foreign assistance, and a lot of other donors as well, is oftentimes too far away from the field, as John just noted. You'll hear the concept of ownership thrown around, local accountability, country-driven processes. You'll hear all sorts of different terms for it. But it is an essential question of understanding why are decisions being made in Washington, D.C. very, very far away from the countries in question? Why are we not having a dialogue about what those priorities are and where and how those monies are best utilized? So we have a fundamental problem in the sense that, as the amount of aid has increased from the U.S. government, there's a consistent push to sort of centralize what are we getting for our taxpayer dollars, which is a completely legitimate question, which pushes a lot of this on the M&E front about the bean counting, the inputs, the outputs, okay? Because people want to know, understandably, if I'm going to contribute, less than, albeit 1% of the U.S. budget towards these activities, I want to know what we're getting for our money. Also because we just generally want to make sure that they're going to good purposes. But the problem in sort of centralizing, trying to figure out a lot of those processes, has pushed the decision making to Washington, D.C. further and further away from the people who really understand country contexts, and understand what's locally appropriate, and in that sense more likely to be effective and sustainable. So another issue that tends to occur in Washington, and I wouldn't necessarily say it's centralization, but is the sort of determining what money there is and how it's going to be spent and where, without having a good understanding of what's going on out in the field. And this is done through the process of earmarking and writing directives into appropriations bills every year. It's really excellent to push for certain priorities, but what ends up happening, and you'll hear USAID staff complain about it frequently, is by the time they receive their budget, it's earmarked to almost 100%, and there's no room for them to innovate. There's no room for them to determine the most strategic way to use those monies, and it ends up being a cobbling exercise, like a large jigsaw puzzle, to figure out how they're going to meet these directives in order to not upset Congress and be outside of the bounds of the law, which is really, really unfortunate, because these dialogues about how to spend money and what the best ways to do it on a local level, and I'm not just talking about the USAID mission, but these types of conversations that John just detailed with civil society and the ministries in the country in question, don't happen. Because even if they did happen, a lot of times it'd be very difficult to sort of determine to implement programs along those lines, because your budget is already decided. So I think this one other quick area that I would point out, in addition to sort of pushing the decision-making processes back out to the field and having them in the hands of the people who understand what needs to happen most, is long-term planning. Also one of the vagaries of the Washington, D.C. budgeting process is that it's year to year, and that we don't take these long-term views on development. And development doesn't happen in 1 year. You can't get bored with development if you don't get results in 1 year. And the sad fact of the matter is that people put money towards programs and expect to see these types of results without investing nearly enough money in monitoring and evaluation in the first place, and then tend to sort of walk away from things. So I think that would be the second area that I would really outline, is taking that longer term horizon. Someone had mentioned the Millennium Challenge account before, and this is a really innovative program in the sense that the jury's still out in terms of how effectively it's working, but what is interesting is that they have provided multi-year funding in the form of these compacts that go for 3 to 5 years. What's great about that is when a government enters into that compact with the United States government, they know what they're getting. There's no surprises. And next year when the appropriations bills pass, it's not a surprise, and that we don't walk away from the types of agreements that we've had with them about the areas that we'll prioritize. So it's very difficult in the current framework that we're operating in to take these types of long-term approaches. And legislation was mentioned before, and I'm happy to answer the questions, but I think that that's one thing that we would want legislation to address, is allowing development professionals longer-term timelines to implement programs in different countries because we can't expect to see results, and we certainly cannot hope to achieve the types of things that we expect to on a year-to-year basis. What you're going to end up with is a patchwork of individual, albeit well-meaning and perhaps successful individual programs, but you're not going to have comprehensive and transformative results unless you engage with a broader long-term vision of what you're trying to achieve, and the current structure is not set up to allow that. So I think as we explore the types of legislative fixes, whether those are legislative or they're determined by the administration that will go a certain way, and how they seek to do funding, we need to start to keep those principles in mind. And whether CARE would support legislation, I think that would be one of our major priority areas. Is again sort of looking towards the long term, and of course pushing back out the decision-making processes to the field.
Great, thank you very much. Well, those are 4 wonderful sets of comments. I think at this point we should open it up to the audience and ask if you have any questions. Yes, ma'am, front here.
I heard a conversation today. A gentleman said that the literacy rate in Afghanistan is 12%. The education level, the literacy rate, and that in Iraq it's 75%. So I want to know if in Iraq, if that's because of the work that you did.
No. No, Iraq is a fundamentally different country with a different background from Afghanistan, and I'd love to take credit for it, but they're completely different in so many ways. Iraq is a country with a really strong and very proud legacy of having a very excellent education system, health system, existing institutions that go way back to the Turks and the British and way before that. As my Iraqi friends used to tell me in Baghdad, we're the folks that invented laws. And they also said, and by the way, we invented writing too. So more pertinent to your point, these are very proud, well-educated, skillful, dynamic people, and that's why Iraq eventually, despite what you may see on television in little snippets, is going to succeed, and why at the same time, Afghanistan is a completely different situation with another completely different legacy. Even more pronounced tribalism or ethnic separations than you would see in Iraq, and without the cement of existing and relatively, at least a legacy of effective institutions. So very, very different.
But the comment was made that education is a significant component of foreign aid.
It is.
My question is...
Well, it used to be even more. We used to give lots of scholarships to places like the University of Texas, which has cemented love and affection all over the world for the United States, frankly, and it's something that we don't do nearly as much as we used to. But it really depends on the situation here. Let me just say one thing. I really sort of disagree with the fact that all foreign assistance should be poverty-driven or poverty-focused. We can do a lot of that too, but this is a Foreign Service, United States official function. We're a foreign service agency, and sometimes, for example, I'll give you an example in Jordan. If I hadn't had $40 million to put into a policy reform program, balance of payments program, the country would have, one, gone broke. They wouldn't have been able to pay their international bills like to the IMF or the World Bank, and they would not have had the impetus for a whole variety of economic policy reforms that they were happy to do if they had the money to back it up. At the same time, my colleague is absolutely correct. We were doing all kinds of maternal and child health kinds of things, water conveyance. Every place is different. A lot of the countries that are in poverty, that you would say, all things being equal, we ought to sort of divide the pot up equally. It's not going to work because the pot is only so big. You can't get everything. You can't do everything for everyone. And two, some of these countries that are in a state of poverty, take for example Burma or Laos or whatever. There's a number of them. The country's not going to have us there. We will not be invited to come in, and we only work with host country governments that welcome us and for which we have sufficient resources. So anyway, that's another focus on that.
Yes, ma'am, in the back.
In your opinion, how much should the United States consult with other countries who give aid, like Korea, China, European Union? How much should we set an example after them or ask them to participate in the dialogue before we write these bills?
I mean, I guess I would say that I think that I'm not sure how much that affects the legislation per se. I do think that there is a really important role to play in terms of donor coordination, and that I mean there's a lot of elements there. I mean, for the fundamentally, you don't want to be doing something redundant because that's a waste. And there are also things that the U.S. does really well. That we sort of have particular niches that we should fill, and other donors do other things really well. And we should be complementing each other's efforts. I think there's also a way to pool resources in a way that incentivize the receiving countries to actually come up with their own plans. So again, the Global Fund for AIDS, TB, Malaria is an example. Gavi, which works on immunizations, is another example of like a multilateral institution where and frankly, this is the trend in many other donor capitals. There's some risks associated with it, but there's a trend to pool resources and sort of have a recipient government kind of come up with its own plan and pull from those pooled resources. I think it's a good way to coordinate as long as the sort of correct kind of monitoring and evaluation are built in. But I think that's really the role for consultations with other donors.
And if I could just add, I think coordination is really difficult at the legislative level, as he mentioned. But in terms of implementation, there's a lot of opportunity for coordination. And in fact, it can be a very good thing because you can find out what areas a particular country is focusing on, and therefore you can focus on other areas. But it can also be a problem. And I think the classic example with respect to my experience was in Sudan. The donor coordination meetings were very difficult because the U.S. position, at least in terms of democracy and governance, was to work with Southern Sudan and Southern Sudanese political parties and preparing them for elections, whereas the European Union looked at Sudan as a whole country. And so all of their efforts to prepare for elections were focused on at the country level. So in discussions, we were basically speaking two different languages because there were things that we would share with our partners in the South that we could not engage with Khartoum on. So in the coordination meetings, we would sort of have to figure out a delicate way to say, sorry guys, we can't really work with you here. So just to provide an example.
In the development business, donor coordination is like motherhood. Everybody's for it, but it's really kind of hard to do, and it's like motherhood, I suppose. And the other thing, all of these organizations, all of these countries, be it if it's the Canadian Development Agency, if it's the French, if it's GTZ from the Germans, if it's whatever, the Scandinavians. Who love to lecture to the Americans about how we should do more poverty alleviation, for example. Everybody has their own rules, their own regulations, their own bureaucracies. The United States, for example, cannot put money into a fund that goes, for whatever purposes that the French, the Americans, and the Germans agree to. You cannot commingle money if you don't want to go to jail. You can't do that. It's against American law. So we're restricted, just like the French, the Germans, the Canadians, and so forth. by the force of law. There's only so much you can do here. That said, and it's fine. This field separation from the headquarters, it sort of boils down to strategy and philosophy versus implementation in the field. And I really don't have a whole big problem with that, as long as the folks in Washington aren't telling the folks in the field exactly how to do everything, because that's always been the strength of our field missions. The field presence is the reason the Americans have been so effective in doing economic development since World War II, is because we had a substantial presence of field people that were experts. That expertise is being eroded. We don't have the numbers, we don't have the training, and so forth. But for goodness sakes, if you're gonna micromanage from Washington on the strategy front, but don't micromanage on the implementation, because people in the field know best.
Okay. Yes, ma'am. Back.
Hi, everyone. My question, I remember reading in Muhammad Yunus's book, one of his books, that he was saying that most of the aid doesn't actually get to the people who need it. The vast majority of aid actually gets, I don't know if it gets stuck in corruptive governments or goes back to the developed world in salaries. Or, he was talking about a lot of inefficiency. So I'd like to hear your views on that and how.
I would just say one thing that probably isn't going to really answer your question, but it made me think of one of the representative statements. For all you students out there, if you're running to the NGOs to make big salaries, you can just stop now. Unless something's happened in the last
you're right.
9 months since I left, there are no big NGO salaries that as compared to and I think a lot of people who are working in the field are working there because they want to be there, not because they're saving up for that BMW. But someone can.
Well, I think, the only thing, I would completely agree with that point, working for an NGO myself. And I think that there are issues with leakage and, corruption at some levels, and also what's called elite capture of development programs, if they're not, as John was noting before, properly targeted sometimes to those absolute, the most vulnerable groups in some cases can be really, really hard to reach. So you have to make the effort, I think, a lot of times to get to those groups and design, for example, in CARE's education programs, we really try to target people that we consider to be what we call doubly or triply disadvantaged, which would be people who are already marginalized because they're girls, and then on top of it, they may be an ethnic or a linguistic minority and don't fit very well into the public education system if they get there anyway, because it's not in their language and they're not being taught skills or having education tailored to them that actually matters in their daily lives. So that takes effort, and that's the type of effort and targeting that we encourage. But a lot of times things tend to stay a little bit closer to capitals. It varies from situation to situation, but I think it's a gross generalization that a lot of the money is wasted. And I think that some of these things, while there are a lot of examples of that happening, some of these are the misperceptions. Like, I don't know if it was John who mentioned it or not, that the U.S. government gives like 20% of our budget to foreign countries. It's simply not true. We give about 1%, and about half of that is what I would consider poverty-focused foreign assistance.
I think it's absolutely true what Dr. Yunus said. I mean, the truth of the matter is a lot of that money doesn't reach the recipient, because what you're really doing is you're procuring technical assistance and training is really what you're spending your money on. And that a lot of that money, sort of by definition, is coming from a place like the United States. It's going for salaries and overhead for these organizations like the Chemonics of the world or NGOs, which is calculated a little bit differently if you're a nonprofit organization. But absolutely, a lot of that money does not go to the recipient. But we don't pass out checks to folks in Bangladesh anyway. I mean, this is what you're spending your money on. You're spending on technical assistance and training for the most part, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. A lot of programs do directly touch on these people. For example, microfinance programs, which is why I'm such a big fan of them. And I'm really proud of the fact that, also using Jordan as an example, we started microfinance programs there for the first time, and nobody said it would ever work in a place like Jordan, because they said, the guys are, too laid back. They think it's going to be a gift, and the women, you can't trust the women because they're not used to, dealing with loan capital, and it was all completely false. We had 99.9% repayments rate. 75% of our clients were women. It was a magnificent story. So we do touch on real people with real needs. But in other respects, if the water plant breaks down and you don't have any water, you got to fix the plant too. So it's a mix.
This issue of technical assistance, just briefly, is an important one because it is a lot of the money that gets spent, and I think the ambassador is absolutely right that there's the need to sort of purchase the services of experts in many cases, and that's often what foreign aid is being used to pay for. I think the question is if you wanted to push the funding further out and to sort of buy the services of more local organizations, would you be allowed to do that? And there are some barriers to that, actually. And that if, a lot of U.S. assistance is what's called tied aid, and there's, in fact, a legal requirement that it be used to purchase goods and services in the U.S. Probably the most egregious example of this, just in terms of percentages, is U.S. food aid, or at least a big portion of it. About 65% of every dollar that you spend on food aid is sort of non-commodity expenses, which means not food. It could be significantly lower, but there are, through the Farm Bill, actually, a lot of restrictions on what kinds of food can be purchased, as well as where it can be milled, what kind of ships have to carry it, et cetera. Kate actually, she mentioned that U.S. is sort of moving, or that CARE, rather, is moving farther away from U.S. assistance. One of the earlier ways that I'm aware that CARE did that, and since you don't have to brag, I'll brag for you. Right. CARE actually stopped taking what's called PL 480, which is the name of the public law. They stopped taking PL 480 food aid money because it had this restrictions attached to it, and I think came to the determination that it just wasn't good development money. And that's a very controversial and complicated, and I imagine quite difficult decision to walk away from a lot of money when it's on the table, but sometimes it's just actually not worth the trouble.
Right. Question up here, sir.
Yes, I have a couple of questions. Thank you. I have a couple of questions and a few comments, and I haven't had the pleasure to meeting Ambassador Locke in Bolivia. I'm a former senator from Bolivia and live now in Austin, so now I'm a taxpayer. So it's not that I have changed my views on foreign assistance, but I think that there are several elements that all of you have said. And talking about Ms. Francis, I would like to suggest that maybe when you're looking at monitoring, I think you might consider including, and this is to Mr. John Fawcett, an idea that you have the system of regulation in the U.S., but there's no commissioner for foreign assistance. There's not an outside body that's not the government, that it's civil society that will say how you're doing. And all these people contributing all the money to CARE, to every other organization that I know of, but there's nobody measuring independently. So I think that may work. Now, I also agree, I'm not saying that it will work. Some commissioners don't work. But I also like to take up on Ambassador Locke's comment about that not all ought to go to poverty, although I would like for results and other organizations that it would go to alleviate poverty. But I think that also has to do with having a good relationship with the rest of the world. I think that you have overseen that for the last 10 or maybe more years. And in Bolivia, we have now Evo Morales, and that's probably part of the reason that I'm here. Although I keep going back to Bolivia, I stay there long enough, and then I say, well, it's better to get I-35 traffic here and all that. I'll take that. But I think that it didn't happen only with Bolivia. I think that all of Latin America is moving not to the left, which wouldn't be bad, but it's going extremely left and against U.S. and whatever it has to do with private investment and individuals' rights and everything else. So I think that a lot of the foreign assistance has to go to very basic things like education. We led education reform in 1993 in Bolivia. The U.S. wouldn't have anything to do with it, of course, because I think another part of policy is that you have to consult with the country. What does it want to do? It doesn't have to only fight coca growers. With what result? 15 years after fighting with coca growers, now you have a coca grower leader as a president of Bolivia. Exactly what we had told your former colleague, ambassador from the U.S., we told him 15 years ago, we said, well, if you don't find a way to solve the cocaine problem in the U.S., you will have a coca grower or a cocaine person leading Bolivia. Well, unfortunately, that has happened. I'm not saying that President Morales has anything to do with cocaine, but he's the leader. Besides being the president of Bolivia, he's the leader of Coca Growers Association. So that's a fact. There is a political element in this. And the last thing that I will say is that certainly I believe that all the works that results and CARE do are great, but if you had a donor table in the country and the U.S. had to see to which degree in any area can participate, because education is a vast field, as Ambassador Luck said, and I'm a living example of that. I'm a former LASPO fellow and a Fulbright fellow in the U.S. There are many ways in which, at very little cost to the taxpayer, can be very effective. But the U.S. shouldn't say, I'm not going to do education. Why not? I mean, there are so many things in which you can participate in education or in health. I must say, in health, the U.S. is a very big contributor, and it does very well. Thank you.
It's great. Any quick comments? We have about 10 minutes left.
Let me just say something about, I was in Bolivia at the time you're talking about, or I arrived in 1993. And one of the reasons that we chose not to be involved in, for example, education is the same reason that we chose not to be involved in education in Jordan or, agriculture in X country. After you simply do not have the resources to be able to do everything and to meet all the needs. And sometimes there'll be a policy difference in terms of what, it is that our administration or our government would support in terms of the way you would do education. For example, I'm not saying that that's true in Bolivia. I don't really remember exactly that case. But there are things where you basically have to decide strategically where you're going to put your money, and you want to put the most money into basically the sectors where you can have a real impact. Because at the end of the day, you're going to be judged on what you do, not how well you evaluate a project, or not how well you wrote some wonderful document, or whether the grant was phrased in the right way. It's what you do. It's the impact that you have on people's lives. So when we were in Jordan, for example, we had a lot of money. We went from $7 million in 1996 to $130 million the next year, and to $250 million the year after that, which was 1999, which is the year King Hussein died. And we made a strategic decision that we weren't going to try to get into everything, because we knew that the problems in Jordan really boiled down to three things that everybody could agree on. And I'll say just one more thing about that too in a second. And those were that there were too many people, there were too few jobs, and they were running out of water. Now, if we'd added, and the schools aren't so hot, by the way, we're going to fix, we would have dissipated the incredible amount of money that we were able to put into to really transform some of the economic sectors of that country, from microfinance to banking reform to the stock market to absolute basic human needs stuff, all the way up to real structural stuff. So it was very exciting, but it really depended. I will say, the best from my point of view, the best situation you can have is like we were lucky enough to have in Jordan in 1999 when King Hussein, God rest his soul, passed on. And that is, we had a lot of money, because you don't always have that. We had a very, very good staff, and believe me, they don't always have that now. 3, we had a very competent and very willing partner in the government of Jordan, and it's their country after all. And we were proud to work with such people that were determined to be reformers after a long period of not changing and not reforming. They were with the program. And we were able to absolutely, with the cooperation and the leadership of the Jordanians, we were able to really have one of foreign assistance' greatest, I would say, greatest successes.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am, right here. Sure.
Hi, good evening. Our darling, Austin's darling, and UT's darling, Ambassador Ron Kirk, is as a trade ambassador. He's touting trade as an economic development attached, addressing poverty as well, and as a terms of poverty alleviation as a tactic to release aid dependency. I'd like to hear your take on that.
He's right.
Well, I mean, I think I would add, we certainly would agree, and I think, consider foreign assistance along the line. I think people think of foreign assistance, again, as this general service delivery model and not recognizing the fact, per the comments that were made before, that a lot of it is about capacity building, and there's a lot of trade capacity enhancement that's involved in foreign assistance. I think everyone would agree that you cannot provide assistance to people ad infinitum, as noted by the graduation comments that were made several times in the letters, the statements that were read by the congressman. So I think everyone completely agrees, and I think, I had been asked to mention just a couple of quick points about the legislation that's been referred to a few times in here, both in the House and the Senate. I think that one thing that is really important, I know that there's some cynicism in having a strategy for global development, but one thing that is called for in the current House H.R. 2139, which is this Initiating Foreign Assistance Reform Act, is a strategy that would take into consideration all those things, not just foreign assistance, but also our policies as they relate to trade, debt relief. It makes no sense to give a country millions of dollars in aid if you turn around and have harmful trade policies towards them. And there's a classic example, I think it's with Bangladesh, that I hear cited over and over and over again, where we actually collect something like 3 times as much from them in tariffs because we have a really unequal trading relationship as we do to provide them with aid. And Bangladesh is one of the poorest countries in the world, and not to mention a strategically important one if we're talking about the many purposes of foreign assistance. So you have to take a holistic approach when you're talking about helping countries, and not just foreign assistance, but our trade policies and all the different things that we do that sort of help create the stage on which poverty is set. So I would completely agree with that comment.
I think we have time for one last question. Eugene?
Hi, I'm Eugene Goltz. I'm the grumpy person Dara mentioned. And I really appreciate your comments. It's a very interesting panel. But I'm gonna poke at my colleague Kate in my question because I think she set you all up by asking for the one thing that you wanted to change. And the trouble with foreign aid, like with most policy issues, is that you can't change one thing. That life's full of ugly trade-offs. And in all of your comments, even within one speaker, you've talked about things that you hope and aspire to change and you want to make better. And then in your next comment, there's something else that you also want to do that's inconsistent with the first. And so I want you to broaden out and actually address these and make choices. So, issues like you want to include the locals and do what the locals want, but at the same time, you want to have a strategy for trying to improve, to cause development, to try to have them do things they wouldn't otherwise do. Like, I'm going to give lots of aid to people who think you shouldn't spend money on that other ethnic group, right? All right, now what do? You can't incorporate their choice, which is to repress that one ethnic group, with your aid strategy. Or I want to have people out in the field making all the choices, but I want to have a long-term strategy where I'm going to stick to it and have an organized, centralized approach to who's going to get aid and how they're going to. You can't do both. Or I want a political constituency to have lots of aid because we don't give enough, but I hate everyone who will lobby for aid as long as it's earmarked a certain way or as long as it involves private distribution like Chemonics or somebody like that, right? You've got to make choices. Am I willing to work with private industry if that gets me more aid? Or is it more important to me to have less aid, but aid that's only given by, pure government officials, whoever they might be? And so if you could each give a quick comment on the trade-offs.
Okay.
Eugene, there are no inconsistencies in monitoring and evaluation. And you didn't mention any.
Sure.
And I appreciate that.
Okay, I'll take a crack at one of them. I see the desire to have an overarching strategy and pushing more control out to the field as not being mutually exclusive. I think you can set a broad overarching framework in terms of what the U.S. government is trying to achieve, but saying, okay, USAID mission in consultation with the local government, which is informed by conversations with civil societies and local experts, you set the tactics on how to determine we reach those goals. Maybe those goals are as broad as promote human security, okay, human development. I don't like to use national security. Human security, I think, is an issue that CARE holds really dear to its heart. We understand that national security is important, but it has so much to do with people. You set human security goals in the sense of you want people to have basic services, these sorts of things, but you let them determine how to do it. You don't go to them, in the case of, for example, Ethiopia, I just read an example today, where you say, okay, here's an actually large sum of money. Ethiopia is one of a country that actually does get a lot of assistance from the U.S. government, but you only have $20 million out of the $900 million to actually innovate on how to do that. You allow them some space to make decisions for themselves with these broad consultations, guided by the strategy. So I don't think anybody wants to write a strategy, and no anyone in Washington, D.C. who's currently talking about this is talking about writing a strategy that lashes things down so tightly that there's no room for country-level consultation. So I think that's a little bit of a false dichotomy.
Does anyone else want to take a crack at the intractable political question?
I mean, I think just one thing I would note is that there are a number of obvious sorts of trade-offs. One of the things that I've just found really encouraging, as I hope this isn't too much of an aside, but the House Foreign Affairs Committee that's working on this legislation has been coming out with a series of kind of concept papers, right? We're sort of like, this is where we're thinking, this is where we're headed. The most recent iteration of that had a full page of these different kinds of trade-offs, 2 or 3 or 4 of which you've just mentioned. I just have to say, like, to see that kind of a document that was actually that, so it didn't resolve any of them, or it tried, but even just identifying them, I think, is such a challenge, and to see that thoughtful of a document, I hope this doesn't sound too bad, come from the Hill, was really, really remarkable. And I think it just reflects that, number one, that they're thinking really seriously about it. They're being humble about the fact they don't have all the answers. They're also listening to a lot of us are saying, and also acknowledging that we're telling them totally conflicting things. Very briefly on the local ownership kind of tension, I would agree with Kate that I think that it is, appropriate and necessary that the U.S. express its prerogatives and goals and then leave some room in terms of the how. So I think, again, to go back to education, I think it is right that the U.S. express as its own kind of moral case and certainly national security and human security case that it's not okay that 75 million kids who are primary school age are not in school. And we need to address that. Here's a chunk of money to do that. Let's, set out the metrics by which we want to evaluate progress against that, and then give host countries, both national governments, but then also people that are not represented in the national government, some flexibility about how to do that approach. So we're not ever going to give lump sums of money and say, you own it, go do what you will. But to set out clear objectives and then allow some people some flexibility on the implementation. Obviously, the devil is, as it always is, in the details.
We are just about out of time, so maybe 50 words or less for last word.
I would just say, when I heard the comment about a lot of the more influence from the field, I was a little concerned about that because I personally don't think all the decisions should be made in the field. They wouldn't be anyway. But I think there should be a sort of firewall between having a larger strategy and then, a separation between the folks that are developing that strategy and the folks that are implementing it. For basic reasons, basic rent-seeking sort of behavior that happens in the field, oh, this is a great project that I came up with and, it should be funded, and then I'm going to implement it too. There are all kinds of problems that are related to monitoring and evaluation with that. So that's all I want to add on that.
I will conclude with the illuminating remark that one of the nice things that I've seen over the last few years happen in the development world is sort of this dichotomy of a shared priorities between defense, diplomacy, and development. I mean, the so-called three-legged stool. And I'm an Iraq veteran, okay, and I've been on the receiving end of the Department of Defense in some respects, and I say that with completely all due respect for the good things that they do and how they do them. But people really do, if there were viable alternatives out there in a place like Iraq or Afghanistan or any other place, there's some places you really don't want the Department of Defense taking over development functions, which could be otherwise done in a more effective way, despite the fact that our soldiers are out there, doing an incredible job. They thought they were going to, carry a M16 and do something, and suddenly they're building a well, and then they got to go use their M16 again. It's got to be a little confusing. All right, diplomacy has something like 7,000 foreign service officers in it. I mean, I think we probably hire that many soldiers in about a month. Okay, and development, the USAID side, and I go back to my original point about how we need to balance these functions of development with diplomacy and defense. I mean, in the 70s, USAID carried out an immense number of programs directly themselves, implementing them directly. We had 5,000 employees. Now we have way less than 1,000, and we're starting to add little by little back onto this, but it's way out of balance. We do not have the budget. We do not have the personnel. The personnel don't have the training. The experienced people have been going out the door for 25 years. And we can do this. We can be the best development agency and with the best, largest amount of resources, even though on a GDP basis it's not that great. But total amount, it's the highest. We can do a good job with it because we've learned a lot of lessons. We've been in the forefront of a lot of the development, stories, microfinance, and so forth. For years, we can reestablish this, but it takes commitment, it takes resources, and it takes the support of Congress.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We have a few final words from Suzanne Berman, but can you please join me in thanking the panelists at this point in time?
Thank you all for coming out tonight. It's really great to have all the perspectives in the room. And again, we can't thank the panelists enough for coming either near or far to join us. And we have a small token of our appreciation. But one thing I'd like to do is, could all the planning committee folks stand up from Results and Care? I want to thank these people, first of all, but then also, more importantly, these are folks that if we want to continue the conversation, they're the people we want to talk to. And there is a table in the back behind the exit sign where you can find out information on the legislation and on the advocacy work that we're doing here in Austin. And again, we are all local. So we, thank you once again for coming, and have a wonderful evening.